There is no Saturn dealership on that corner anymore. There is no oval logo mounted above the glass. There is no showroom designed around the idea that the person walking through the door deserved to be treated differently than every other car buyer in America had been treated for the previous 30 years. There is a cell phone retailer in one location, a mattress store in another, a vacant lot with faded asphalt where the service bays used to be, still showing the ghost of painted lines that once organized a parking area for cars waiting on work that will never be done there again. What stood in those places was not a conventional American car dealership. It was, for a specific window of time, proof that the American automobile industry could do something its critics had declared permanently beyond its reach. It could build a small car that buyers who had already left would come back for. It could earn loyalty from people who had sworn off domestic brands entirely and had specific, documented reasons for doing so. General Motors created Saturn to prove that argument. Saturn proved it. And then General Motors spent the better part of 2 decades dismantling every element of Saturn that had made the proof possible, one decision at a time, each one logical in isolation and collectively fatal. What that cost, in buyers permanently lost and in market position permanently ceded, is a number GM has never published and has spent 15 years hoping nobody calculated. By the late 1970s, the American small car had developed a reputation it had earned honestly. Not through perception, not through advertising failures, not through a branding problem that better marketing could solve, but through the accumulated experience of millions of buyers who had purchased domestic small cars, driven them, repaired them, and drawn conclusions. The conclusions were unfavorable. The conclusions were also accurate. Quality surveys from that period documented a gap between domestic and Japanese small car reliability that was not marginal. It was the kind of gap that changes buying behavior permanently, because a buyer who has been burned twice does not wait for a third demonstration. They make a decision, they tell the people around them, and they stop being available to the manufacturer that burned them. GM's own internal research acknowledged this. The problem was real. The standard corrective measures available within the existing system were not sufficient to close it. The existing system was the problem. Plants organized around labor agreements that prioritized seniority over quality, management structures that separated the people building the cars from any feedback about what happened to those cars afterward, and a divisional hierarchy so focused on its own internal politics that improving the small car had to compete for resources against protecting the market positions of vehicles that were already profitable. Roger Smith, who became GM's chairman in 1981, reached a conclusion that his predecessors had avoided reaching. Fixing the small car problem could not be done inside the institution that had produced it. It required something built outside, deliberately insulated from the habits and the politics and the inherited assumptions that had made the problem intractable in the first place. The announcement came in 1983. A new subsidiary, not a division. A separate corporation with its own facility, its own labor agreement, its own retail model, and its own product development authority. The investment commitment Smith announced was larger than anything GM had directed at a new venture in decades. Inside the existing divisions, the reaction was not celebratory. Saturn's founding logic was specific and deliberately constructed. The no-haggle retail model existed because the negotiation process at conventional dealerships had been documented as a primary reason import buyers cited for preferring the experience of buying from Japanese brands. The Spring Hill, Tennessee facility was built on a greenfield site, chosen in part because it allowed a labor agreement to be negotiated from a blank page rather than layered onto an existing contract with decades of accumulated provisions. The separate UAW agreement at Spring Hill gave the plant operational flexibility that no other GM facility had. Workers could stop the production line, Teams were organized around responsibility for outcomes rather than performance of discrete tasks. These were not cosmetic differences. They were direct responses to documented failure modes in the existing system. Skip LaFauve, who served as Saturn's president through the years when the subsidiary's identity was being established, understood something that would become important later. The independence was not a feature of Saturn. It was the mechanism. The no-haggle model worked because it was consistent. The quality commitment worked because the people building the cars had authority over the process. The conquest sales worked because buyers who had left domestic brands had a specific reason to try again. Remove the independence, and the mechanism stops. The feature disappears because the thing producing it is gone. Early customer satisfaction results reflected what the design was supposed to produce. Saturn's rankings in independent quality surveys rose to levels that matched, and in some years exceeded brands GM had identified as unreachable competitors. More precisely, surveys documented that a measurable percentage of Saturn buyers stated directly that they would have purchased a Japanese import if Saturn had not existed. These were not buyers choosing Saturn over another GM product. They were buyers returning to domestic manufacturing for the first time in years, or for the first time ever, because Saturn had given them a reason that held up. The committee that had resisted Saturn's resource allocation before the launch watched those numbers and said nothing publicly. The S-Series, the purpose-built lineup that launched Saturn, had a normal competitive lifespan. Small cars in a competitive market needed generational renewal on a cycle measured in years, not decades. By the late 1990s, the S-Series was aging against competitors that had refreshed their lineups, and Saturn needed replacement product. What GM provided instead was the L-Series, a sedan and wagon based on a European platform that had been developed by Opel, GM's German subsidiary, for a market with different expectations, different road conditions, and a different buyer profile than the one Saturn had spent a decade cultivating. The decision was made without Saturn's agreement. Reports from that period suggest Saturn's management opposed the platform substitution and was overruled. The institutional logic that produced the decision was the same logic that had stripped other GM divisions of engineering independence a generation earlier. Platform consolidation reduced development costs across the corporation. Saturn was one subsidiary among several. The efficiency argument was arithmetically sound and strategically ruinous, and the people making it either did not see the difference or decided it was acceptable. The L-Series had documented quality and reliability problems that registered immediately in the surveys Saturn had spent a decade building. The buyers who had come back to domestic manufacturing, specifically because Saturn's quality record had convinced them it was safe to return, noticed. Consumer reports noticed. The conquest the S-Series had achieved began reversing. The mechanism changed. The outcome was familiar. Saturn's dealerships were the exclusive retail channel for the EV1, GM's electric vehicle program that ran through the late 1990s. This was not incidental. Saturn's buyer demographic, environmentally conscious, import experienced, specifically attracted to products that represented something different from the mainstream, was the demographic most likely to lease an electric vehicle in the period before electric vehicles had established a mass market. The pairing was deliberate, and it worked in the terms available to it. Lessees documented strong satisfaction. Requests came in asking whether purchase options would be made available when leases ended. GM canceled the program. The official reasoning pointed to infrastructure limitations, battery technology constraints, and the conclusion that the path to profitability was longer than the investment justified. The cars were recalled. The recall was followed by destruction. Lessees who had requested the option to purchase their vehicles outright were declined. The cars were crushed. What that decision communicated to the specific buyers Saturn had built its identity around was not ambiguous. The product those buyers had most explicitly requested had been removed. The vehicles themselves had been eliminated rather than sold or donated, and Saturn's lineup going forward offered nothing that distinguished it from the consolidated GM product portfolio in the way the EV1 had. Sources conflict on the precise internal deliberations. What is not in conflict is what Saturn's showrooms looked like afterward, and which buyers stopped coming. GM gave the answer it always gave, when the cost of continuing something genuinely different exceeded the tolerance of a quarterly earnings cycle. The bankruptcy filing came in June of 2009. The restructuring required decisions about which brands to continue and which to close. The argument is sometimes made that those decisions were purely financial, that the brands discontinued were the ones that could not survive the arithmetic of a reorganized balance sheet, and that Saturn's closure was a consequence of market forces rather than institutional choice. That argument is worth examining directly because it is the argument that will be made. Saturn's customer satisfaction and loyalty metrics at the time of the bankruptcy announcement were stronger than several brands GM chose to retain. The data existed. It was not hidden. A buyer base that had been systematically underserved by platform substitution and program cancellation had still not fully abandoned the brand that had originally earned their trust. Roger Penske's acquisition group reached a tentative agreement to purchase Saturn as an independent brand, which would have preserved the dealer network, the nameplate, and the buyer relationships without requiring GM's ongoing financial involvement. That deal collapsed. Reports indicate the specific obstacle was a manufacturing supply agreement. Penske needed GM's cooperation on production terms to make the acquisition viable, and the terms available were not ones that made the acquisition workable. GM's role in the collapse has been reported with varying emphasis, and the precise responsibility has never been formally settled. What is settled is the outcome. The brand with the strongest demonstrated ability to attract buyers who had left domestic manufacturers permanently was discontinued. Brands with weaker loyalty profiles and heavier overlap with Chevrolet's existing lineup were retained. The institution got what it wanted. The corporate structure was simplified. The subsidiary that had always complicated the internal hierarchy by operating outside, it was gone. The Spring Hill facility retooled and continued operating, producing vehicles for a different brand on the same floor where Saturn's labor agreement had once made it the most examined manufacturing experiment in American automotive history. The experiment's conclusions were not applied elsewhere. They were not archived for future reference. The floor was repurposed, and the question of what the results meant was never formally answered by the institution that had commissioned the test. 3 kills across roughly 2 decades. The platform independence removed by the same consolidation logic that had ended divisional engineering autonomy elsewhere in the corporation. The electric program canceled and the vehicles destroyed before Saturn's buyer base could organize its loyalty around them. The bankruptcy decision that chose institutional tidiness over the one brand in GM's portfolio that had documented evidence of reaching buyers the rest of the corporation could not. The buyers Saturn had conquered did not return to GM after the closure. That was never a likely outcome. A buyer who chose Saturn because it was different from the rest of GM's lineup, who then watched every element that made it different get removed one by one, who then watched the brand close, does not naturally redirect that loyalty to the brands whose market positions had been protected throughout Saturn's existence at Saturn's expense. They go where the evidence tells them to go. The evidence told them clearly. GM created Saturn to prove that American manufacturers could compete on quality and customer experience with the import brands that had taken a permanent segment of the American market. Saturn proved it. The proof ran for roughly a decade in its functional form before the institutional decisions that could not coexist with a genuinely independent subsidiary made the proof impossible to sustain. What the institution did not anticipate, or anticipated and accepted, was that the buyers Saturn had brought back were not on loan. They were on trust. And trust, once extended and then systematically withdrawn, does not wait around to see if the institution eventually figures out what it discarded. The segment Saturn was built to compete in is now led by manufacturers whose commitment to it has been consistent across the same decades GM spent deciding whether Saturn deserved the resources its own results had justified. The electric vehicle category Saturn distributed, before anyone else in domestic manufacturing took it seriously, is now the defining automotive market of the current decade. The brands leading it are not American. GM built the car that could have held that ground. Then it built the most efficient path to losing it that institutional logic could construct. If that is the kind of story that deserves to be told, subscribe and drop a comment below with the next suppressed program, the next canceled idea, or the next chapter of American automotive history that the official account left out. We read everyone. The next video starts down there.